Welcome to the 5th session of the annual Ermie Bourne Lecture in the beautiful and resourceful parish of St. Andrew, the home of Dame Edna Ermintrude Bourne. The St. Andrew branch of the Barbados Labour Party, the Thursday Club, and the Ermie Bourne Foundation, including the chairman of the foundation, Mr. Simeon Belgrave, and under the patronage of the former Member of Parliament, George Payne, host this 5th session of the annual Ermie Bourne Lecture. Tonight, we have returned to the Allen School for the long-awaited presentation. My name is Sonia King, and I am excited and honored to be your Master of Ceremonies for the evening. We are joined this evening by the Honourable Marcia Cadell for a fascinating and engaging lecture entitled Revisiting the Model, Co-Creating Democratic Development in Barbados. Before I introduce the current guardian of the Ermie Bourne legacy, the Member of Parliament for the constituency of St. Andrew, Dr. the Honourable Ramal Springer, please allow me a few moments to share her story, her legacy. Dame Edna Ermintrude, or Ermie Bourne, was born on August 4th, 1918. She was an educator, a social worker, humanitarian, and the former Member of Parliament for St. Andrew. She created history when, on the introduction of universal adult suffrage, she became the first woman elected to Parliament. Dame Edna forged her path of political development that resulted in her being returned as senior member for St. Andrew in 1951 and the 1956 general elections. I remember those video clips showing her entry into Parliament. This event was heralded by one of the largest crowds assembled to see any Member of Parliament assume office. The excitement on the faces of those gathered showed that it would indeed be a historic and life-changing event. For her service to the nation, Dame Edna Ermintrude Ermie Bourne has been knighted, and the East Coast Road, with its breathtaking and majestic views, was named after her. The Ermie Bourne Centre, headquartered in Hillaby, St. Andrew, has been established in order that her achievements are not lost to the younger generations of Barbados. In 2018, as a part of her centennial celebrations, the Ermie Bourne Foundation was established as a memorial charity trust honoring her stewardship. On Saturday, the 25th of August, 2018, the inaugural annual Ermie Bourne Lecture was held. The Ermie Bourne Foundation celebrates as its aims and objectives the improvement in the standard of living of the people of St. Andrew, the empowerment of women in community service and public life in Barbados, the creation of opportunities for the most poor and vulnerable in rural Barbados. Cognizant of the achievements of this matriarch of St. Andrew, we gather to acknowledge and commemorate her investment. Please join me, therefore, in welcoming Dr. the Honourable Ramal Springer, the Member of Parliament for the constituencies of St. Andrew, who will introduce our orator for the evening. I thank you.
Good evening, all. This year, as we continue to celebrate the life and work of Ermie Bourne as a pioneer and inspiration for women in this country and beyond, it is my privilege and indeed an honor to introduce tonight's featured speaker. Marcia Cadell is an international economist and public policy strategist and is the president and chief economist of the Bourne Center, a global advisory firm helping institutions, governments, and companies design and execute transformational development initiatives. As Minister for Economic Affairs and Investment from 2018 to 2022, she helped lead Barbados' 2018 economic recovery and also led Barbados' delegation to the COP26 Climate Summit, where she was lead finance negotiator for the Alliance of Small Island States. Her areas of work are climate finance and sustainable development, poverty, inequality, and human development, public investment, growth and competitiveness, financing for development, physical planning, and data and national statistics. She has worked at the Caribbean Development Bank, led the Poverty and Economic Security practice with the United Nations Development Programme, and the Economic Security and Rights Program of the then United Nations Development Fund for Women, now UN Women. Marcia has lived in Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, Washington, D.C., and London before returning to Barbados in 2009. Her work experience in economic policy and human development spans over 20 countries, and she has written and spoken extensively on matters of equality and economic and climate justice. She studied at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus and then received a master's in economics from the Universidad Católica Santo Domingo in 2002, and has since continued her training in international economics with the University of Utah and in poverty analysis and measurement with the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. In 2005, she also co-founded the Women's Health Advocacy Network, which promotes civil organization on issues such as violence against women, sexual and reproductive rights, patient advocacy, and women's health. Ms. Cadell has written and spoken extensively on economic justice issues, as well as advised governments and international organizations on inclusive growth, macro-fiscal governance, and inequality. Throughout, her goal is to help make economic and social justice visible, desirable, and achievable in the lives of all people. Marcia Cadell is a trained dancer, teacher in dance and Caribbean movement, singer-songwriter, guitarist, and former football player. She has, since May 2018, been an elected member of Parliament in the Barbados House of Assembly, representing the constituency of St. Michael's South Central. Ladies and gentlemen, join me as I welcome to the podium to deliver this year's lecture, the Honorable Marcia Cadell.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here at the Allen School in St. Andrew to have a conversation with you on some matters of development and society. Now, just over 6 years ago, in May 2017, I was very privileged to deliver the Grantley Adams Memorial Lecture at the Central Bank of Barbados in Bridgetown. The title of that lecture was Survive or Transform: Why It's Now or Never for a New Development Model in Barbados. A now very close friend and colleague of mine did us the honor then of serving as chairperson for the evening's discussion. And he reports to me that when he first heard the title, he was taken aback by its audacity. He wondered about this woman whom he did not know and who had set herself such a bold task as to offer new frameworks and additional understandings for the problems of Caribbean development and their solutions. And he wondered whether this woman, whom he did not know, would be able to deliver. I hope, and he did confirm, that after I had shared some thoughts on that evening, he was reasonably satisfied that I had not dared in vain. And I'm glad that he was suitably relieved, but it occurs to me that such occasions like that one, occasions like this, are less a performance to be assessed or to entertain for a time, and more an opportunity to take stock of what we, who are in the business of development, are doing. Why, by, with, and for whom we are doing it, how we are doing it, and to what end. So, while I hope that those thoughts shared 6 years ago could stand then as worthwhile ideas, The real worth of those thoughts comes in considering whether 6 years later, those ideals hold true. Whether 5 years of government later, the policy imperatives that were discussed then have managed to find and occupy any space in our government's agenda, and whether we have learned anything in that time that allows us to refine, expand, or better focus that model in pursuance of a better life for our people in Barbados and in the region. So it's within that framework that I propose to revisit that model a little, underpinning it, I hope, with ideas for an active, democratically co-created development. That sounds like a mouthful, but I'm going to say a little bit about what that means. Ideas for an active, democratically co-created development that serves each citizen, each resident of a country, each member of a society, including its leadership today and in the future. I'm going to say that again. I'm hoping that as we reflect on the thoughts that were shared at that time and see whether they hold true, whether we have been true to those ideas that we shared 6 years ago, I hope to underpin some of those thoughts with more ideas for an active development that we co-create democratically. A development that serves each citizen of a country, each member of a society, including and especially its leadership, and gives lessons for how we want to develop together. It similarly occurs to me that Dame Edna Ermie Bourne, as the first woman elected to the House of Assembly in Barbados in 1951, was likely also accused at that time of severe audacity. I like to believe that daring is the way of the women of the Barbados Labour Party. Leadership that is transformational must dare. It must dare to learn new things, to test ideas, to change course quickly if needed, albeit not chaotically if it can be helped. And moreover, leadership that is transformational must dare and does dare to lead differently. The conversation that we began 6 years ago started with a bit of a story about me as a child of a working class family, a lover of dance that I was only able to learn through free community classes, musical and vocal performance that I was only able to access through free primary and secondary school choir teachers, and a deep love for and understanding of Caribbean music forms who found their origins and evolution in the protection of the African spirit and rebellion against the oppression that was everywhere at all times. I shared this background then to lay bare the idea of the politician as either the historically wealthy professional who brings their riches to bear on the democratic process and on their own elective outcomes and on their own scope for survival, and who are motivated by gaining access to more power and influence than mere money could buy, or as the suffering ne'er-do-well who saw political service as a way to get at the fatted calf, as it has been unfortunately framed and unfortunately characterized. So when at that time I shared a little bit about me as somebody who was now coming to political service, the idea was to make the idea of a person who comes and presents themselves for political service, to present it as one that, as an idea or as a stepping forward that finds its place in honor, that comes from an honorable place, that it is not simply, as it has been historically known to be, the purview or the realm of wealthy professionals who would then be able to bring their wealth to bear on their political fortune, or the realm of what some might consider the opposite, people who saw no prospects but tried to get involved in political life as a way to get access to resources that they would not otherwise have. And I wanted to challenge that idea. I found it offensive to all of the hard work, not just of people who present themselves for formal elective politics, but people who work alongside those who work in elective politics and political service. I wanted then to demonstrate a different kind of example of the kind of person who comes to public life and why. I wanted to cause us to interrogate the idea that a person who comes to public life must be up to no good, to acknowledge the transparent and accountable governance that countries like Barbados especially have been able to cultivate by design, and not to allow a few examples of greed and corruption coupled with ineptness and indiscipline that we had unfortunately seen at the time to define us, or to define for us, what is the Caribbean politician. So that as we create in our systems and in our public discourse the wherewithal to hold public officers and political leaders accountable for not doing the right thing, we similarly make room in our consciousness for the notion that people who have come to serve have come to do and will do the right thing. And simply put, it is really to challenge the idea and to reintroduce us collectively to the notion of honor in political service and what that looks like, and how do we encourage that, and how do we promote that, and how do we resource that. So in asking us to do this, I'm asking us to take a different approach to governance and development. It is an approach of co-creating democratic development. This co-creation, this doing together between the state and citizens and groups and other actors, is one of the characteristics of how women like Ermie Bourne, like Billy Miller, like those who followed, lead transformationally. It's not something that only women do, but it is arguably something that women have seen to do more readily and with outstanding results. In instances where ego and bravado do not serve and perhaps are or were not considered tools at the disposal of women. Why is it important to co-create, to imagine and execute together as people the kind of democratic leadership and system of democracy we want? And how is not doing so causing us all harm? The first reason has to do with equality and quality. Historically, politicians were people with means. They not only leveraged their networks for political success, they were able to spend their personal and generational resources, not just at the election point in the political cycle, but in several cases throughout their term. The financing of community programs and household budget support, not through government, but through the personal resources of parliamentarians, is a model that continues today. But in this model, the children of poor people cannot be politicians, no matter their qualification for or commitment to the task, no matter their personal integrity or professional capability. The nature of poverty is that it is intergenerational, forward and backwards. A child, now come of age, who quote unquote makes it out from below the poverty line today, has to pay it backward generations in financial and other care for parents, grandparents, and other relatives, and has to pay it forward generations in investments to try and protect their children and their future generations from becoming poor. I want to say that again. A child who now comes of age, a person who now becomes an adult, and who we consider has made it out from below the poverty line that their family has experienced, has to, by virtue of coming from a poor or working class family and being the only one or among the few who have now been able to, and let me use a word that I don't like to hear us use, escape poverty, that child, that person who has now come of age, has to pay it backwards generations in terms of the financial care that they still have a responsibility for their parents and their grandparents and their relatives. And they also have to pay it forward in investments to try and protect their children and future generations from poverty and vulnerability. The child of a working class family has no personal finances on the order of hundreds of thousands to fulfill the development expectations of members of their community. If we do what we've always done, we will get what we've always gotten. Barbados has been fortunate to have leaders in the past that perhaps embodied the convergence of capital and care. Capital, having money, and care, having concern for other people and wanting to make their lives better. We've been fortunate to have had leaders that represent that convergence. But we've had some recent tastes of those who do not, who have sought capital at the expense of cure. By reinforcing this model, by not acknowledging that there is a cost to democracy and that people deserve representation and community development that is honestly and transparently financed, by doing that, we say to generations of working class parents and their children that leadership is not an option for them. They cannot break the intergenerational curse of poverty while spending their own limited resources to strengthen their communities, which may be closely bound up with their own chances of political success. Interrogating this model calls for us to consider whether political service and political representation are work. Work where the recruitment process is perhaps unlike other categories of work, but also where the worker has very few of the protections under law currently afforded to other categories of worker. Establishing political representation and action as work, how then does a democratic society attract and keep the talent, commitment, effectiveness, and other characteristics in our political leaders and leadership officials that we seek in other kinds of jobs with similarly high stakes? I'm going to repeat that because I want us to understand where I'm trying to go on this journey. If we establish that political representation, that political action is work at the level of the parliamentary representative or other levels, if we establish and accept that it is work, how do we co-create a democratic society that attracts and keeps the talent, the commitment, the honesty, the effectiveness, the integrity, and all the other characteristics that we want to see in political leaders and leadership officials, just as we would want to see them in other jobs with high stakes? There is a second harm that we do to our national consciousness and to our individual prospects for success by failing to reimagine the quality and character of political leaders and leadership, by not leaving space for the possibility for political actors to act in ways that are right. The harm that we risk doing is that we opt out of our own society and our own well-being. We opt out, and I'll say a bit about what I mean. It is in some ways safe to decide, even in the absence of evidence, that leaders are bad faith actors. Because then we do not have to interact with the truth of facts or with the truth of events, which is mental and emotional work. So it's easier for us to say, man, all them politicians so. Because it's less work for us, collectively and individually. It's less mental and emotional work. Mental because if we don't do that, then we have to read or watch or listen to more than one perspective or to independent assessments, and not just our friends or not just entertaining content that we find online. And emotional because when we trust people, even a little bit, when we suspend cynicism and open ourselves up to learning the truth, we make ourselves vulnerable. And that, for most of us, is a deeply uncomfortable thing. So what am I suggesting? I'm not saying that it is enough for a political leader to say to you, look, just trust me. I'm not suggesting that that's what is the solution. That's not governance. But I am saying that there's some extent to which we must seek collectively, individually, we must seek and embrace reliable information as the basis on which we determine what we believe. If you're about to cross the street and you have sight, you look to see whether there's a vehicle approaching. If you have hearing, you listen for the sounds of oncoming traffic. You do not suspend all evidence of what is before you because you cultivated a belief that this road is pedestrian access only and no cars pass this way. You believe, you seek evidence to help you make the decision you are about to make, and you believe the evidence that you perceive. A democratic development that we co-create is one in which there is a role for data and evidence. and an environment in which people are encouraged to learn how to interpret that evidence and how to use it. Now, I talked 6 years ago about the role of published reliable data in discussing this first of 4 pillars that I am sharing with you tonight. At that time, I framed the first of those 4 pillars as democratic governance. But now I'm framing it and this entire model as co-created democratic development. The new democratic governance I called for then centered on shared data that is accurate, timely, and fully available to all. It pointed to the open data principles that would see government publish online procurement information relating to the award of contracts for public and public-private works, the real-time status of implementation of key projects and associated budget information, and one that would measure and share information about poverty and living conditions and about and underemployment. That was all in 2017. That new governance at the time would therefore have had a clear independent role for a National Statistical Institute that would report to Parliament directly and have a mandate to also share certain information directly with the people of Barbados to allow them to make decisions. And so, how have we done? There can be no doubt that there is today more and better information available, made possible through a Public Financial Management Act and other pieces of legislation that mandate certain financial reporting and corrective action, particularly on the performance of state-owned enterprises, that prior to 2018 did not exist. But some of the targeted actions that would help move the needle on public trust remain to be done, like procurement information on the award of contracts and the restructuring of the National Statistical Service into an independent statistics institute that reports certain key data directly to Parliament or directly to the public of Barbados. In their absence, and while we wait for those, what has evolved, supporting this expanded model of co-creation between government and citizens, is the greater use of governance by committees of Parliament, both standing committees, allowing further consideration of bills by both chambers, and joint select committees, allowing sector experts, stakeholders, and members of communities to consider and make inputs into law before they are debated and passed. In certain jurisdictions, such as those where all MPs are independent, committee government fully replaces the government versus opposition system. In other words, members are forced to work together in committee with other citizens in order to frame, refine, and pass legislation, because in some of those jurisdictions, there is no party government. All members are independent. There has arguably been no greater use of committee governance in Barbados than now, with major pieces of legislation regarding integrity and the decriminalization of vending benefiting from thorough reviews by committee. Still, in the absence of a robust environment of evidence, such structures may still depend too heavily on the gut feelings and individual values of members of those committees. The published data on procurement, expenditure, and living conditions presented by an independent and appropriately resourced Independent Statistics Institute remain unrealized ideas of that 2017 model, notwithstanding some of the expansions in democracy that are new and being used in further and deeper ways than they have been used before. Economists are often criticized for using as a crutch the notion of scarcity. And in fact, as they teach you in class, every single item or economic good is scarce. That's what you learn in economics. All things are scarce. And the reason that we consider every single item scarce is that it required resources in its production that could have been used elsewhere. But you do not appreciate scarcity until you have tried to contribute to the governance of a small island former colony like Barbados. And perhaps nowhere is that more true than with respect to the people resources needed for transformational development. Just like the resources used to make a pair of shoes were a choice because they might easily have been used to produce a crate of bread, in a country of 270,000 people, the same people who are to benefit from the transformation are the same people who must also bring it about. The same people, the same population, the same individuals who stand to benefit from the transformation, who are consumers of the transformation, who are receivers of the transformation, are also producers of the transformation. They are the ones, we are the ones, who must bring it about. It means that the development choices that a government makes then become about the sequencing of transformation, because the same public officers who must, for example, respond to the Auditor General's report are the same public officers who are in some other quarter working on the reform of state-owned enterprises. This points then to a new role for co-creating development between government and citizens. Co-creating as an approach allows for more non-government people resources to converge with government to get things done. Barbados has a social partnership. The social partnership, joint select committees, and other mechanisms that I've spoken to you about are perhaps the early manifestations of this co-creating approach. But it must go deeper to allow for the creative and other professional talent of other sectors to contribute in practical ways to making governance work better for all. At the base of this conundrum is the fact that public sector salaries far outstrip those in the private sector. But a challenge to a deepened and more effective social partnership might be to move beyond negotiating models of governance to collective models of implementation. I'm going to try to go over that a bit to get to the heart of what I'm getting at. We have a social partnership, for example, that sees us coming together, the state, government, labor, and the private sector, in an approach that called for a coming to the table, a negotiated approach. What do I want? What do you want? How can we converge? And I think what we're beginning to see, but we would benefit from seeing a deepening of, is a move beyond this negotiating model of governance to a collective model of implementation, where some of the gaps of implementation, of execution, of analysis that simply cannot be met in the public sector can be co-created and co-executed with labor, with the private sector. It calls for a new role for those who make up the social partnership. It especially calls for a new role for labor. It calls for a collective understanding among us that the model of labor representation that was only about conflict must now become about jointly coming together to find solutions. And it may look different. It may not look like marches and picket lines, even though sometimes those may be necessary. But it may be quieter. It may be about having honest conversations about what benefits workers, what benefits all people, and what benefits or helps the state deliver what it must deliver to citizens. Co-creating a democratic development calls on all of us to expect new and different things from our leadership and to recognize those things when we see them. This co-creating idea is not new, but it is perhaps apt for democracies like Barbados that are seeking to strengthen people's participation and responsibility alongside their strengthened capacities and rights. So in other words, the more the state invests successfully in people's rights and productive capacities like health, education, and job creation, the more the state invests successfully in those rights and capacities, the more people are able to contribute responsibly to the state's own capacity so to do, and to the country's collective well-being. It is not a new idea. In fact, the 2021 Barbados population policy rests on this model. It rests on this idea, and I may be paraphrasing a part of it here when I say that it emphasizes contribution and care. Now, the population policy at that time realized that increasing the population size and strengthening a diversity of capacities of the current population creates more opportunities for more people to contribute to the economy, to government revenue, to the labor market, to social development, and to cultural expression. There is a reciprocal relationship between the capacity of the state to care for its people, for example, through education, health, environmental management, social protection, and human rights, and the capacities of the population to make contributions to the state through taxation measures to communities and families and through social care. There is a reciprocal relationship between the capacity of the state to care for its people and the capacities and opportunities created for the population to make contributions to the state. We have tended to see those contributions only as taxes. But the contributions that people make to the state to allow the state to in turn be of service to the population, those contributions look like many things. They look like care. They look like partnering with schools. They look like partnering with communities. They look like parents having parental compacts or learning compacts with teachers and with school leaders and with education officials to acknowledge and to execute and to exercise their role in contributing to the positive learning of all children. So the compact approach, the co-creating approach, is not new in this way. And it is one that I believe we must expand if we are to move to a new stage of development. So with that foundation established of what we mean by co-creating, first in the area of governance, which was one of my 4 pillars 6 years ago, I want to come now quickly to 2 others, which of necessity are being considered together. The first is socioeconomic security, an idea I used then, which is not just about the absence of poverty, but the creation of wealth, the presence of real measured well-being, and sustainable prosperity. The second is of educational fulfillment, with which socioeconomic security is inextricably linked. So what I'm saying here is that socioeconomic security is the language that I prefer to use rather than poverty. Because if we have a poverty model for the provisioning of goods and services to people, then we are only targeting the absence of poverty, which is perhaps easier. Because if we use an income line for poverty and we say this percentage of the population is above that line, then we don't have to look at the other deprivations. But socioeconomic security, that approach calls for us to target the creation of wealth. Most of us, are descendants of those who had nothing and spectators to the creation of wealth among other segments of the population. A new development, a co-created democratic development, must target the creation of wealth for generations of descendants of formerly enslaved African people. It must target the presence of real measured well-being and sustainable prosperity. So how are we doing 5 years, 6 years later? And what do we now appreciate that can improve how we work together to help make better the lives of people? My call at that time was for an approach that saw the interaction of social protection policies, which we call welfare, and local economic development policies. In other words, a way to invest the resources that we use for social protection, not just into things like food support and school uniform programs, some measure of which will always be needed, but also into programs that can help people earn decent incomes from decent work. So in other words, we must transform from the welfare model. And I believe that there has been tremendous political will and action to upend the old welfare model and replace it with something that is more responsive to people's needs. The just launched One Family program acknowledges the various simultaneous deprivations that families and individuals experience. But it also, hopefully, leaves room to acknowledge another truth of poverty or economic insecurity. And that is that it can at once be entrenched, feel immovable, and at the same time be dynamic and changeable. So poverty, economic insecurity can feel and can be something that is sticky, something that is entrenched in families and generations, but it can also be something that is dynamic, that can be here today and not here tomorrow, that can be not here today and here tomorrow. Some of the people who are not poor today are some of those who will be poor tomorrow, in the sense that they will lack something fundamental that they need to make choices that they value and to make their lives better, and they will need support. And so a model of social protection that serves us today has to acknowledge that they're not these two groups of people called the poor and the non-poor. They're not just 200 families or 1,000 families or 1,200 families that need different kinds of help because they're facing multiple deprivations. There are those people, but the nature of economic insecurity is such that it changes, and that there's some of us in here that will need help tomorrow and that should be able to access help tomorrow for a very specific need that may not be neatly captured by a proxy means test or by other instruments that we use today. So social protection and other resources that invest in giving people training, work, business, and other opportunities that can earn them a decent, livable income capable of growth, those measures are still required. This was the call 6 years ago, and the policy response was programs like the Trust Loan Program, an expanded and highly responsive fund access program, a construction gateway program that is dedicated to micro-credentialing in areas of technical and vocational training. But it seems to me that the gap was not so much one of matching the solution to the problem, but it was one of scale. I do not think that we appreciated then the scale of the problem, the size of the gap when it came to the numbers of people with low or no educational attainment in Barbados. It meant that the gap that you had to breach between educational fulfillment and capacity to earn a decent wage was much greater, I dare say, than we had previously anticipated. This is the background against which education transformation has now begun. And it is a mammoth undertaking. It is a mammoth undertaking because education is more than formal learning in classrooms. And at the time of the Grant Adams lecture 6 years ago, the pillar that I used was educational fulfillment, educational and cultural fulfillment. That is different from attainment, because educational fulfillment means that you are learning the things, you are acquiring the knowledge, you are acquiring the skills, and having the learning experience that will allow you to choose the things that you value. It is a fulfillment approach to education, not an exam or attainment approach to education. But the background against which education transformation is taking place is one where, one, the gap of educational attainment that we thought we were responding to at the time was perhaps more profound than we realized. But two, it is coming after COVID, where there is now a compounded gap in educational attainment because the formal learning environment was in many ways disrupted. This education transformation is a considerable feat. And while I don't have the time or the scope here this evening to say much about it, I believe that it is one of the key areas for this co-creation model that we're discussing here this evening. But like many things that we try to do as part of a transformative or transformational development, it doesn't just call for imagining or reimagining, but it also calls for doing in a very precise way. I think there has been quite a bit of focus on this notion of eliminating a single exam. And I dare say that the education transformation that has been presented to us is not simply about eliminating a particular exam. It is a particular exam. It is about deepening educational fulfillment. It is about widening the range of choices that are available to people. It is about mending and fixing gaps at the primary level to make sure that children have the foundation to go forward. But it must be about what I, over the last several years, have been calling fine work. When I talk about fine work, I talk about the unsexy, unglamorous business of getting things done properly. And I think that we have traditionally had a model of an education sector that is large. An education sector that tries to do policy and administration together in one place at the same time. All of the logistics, from security to uniforms to infrastructure to project management, all of those bread and butter foundation issues of educating a population, as well as the policy, the revisioning, the change, the curriculum, the teacher training aspects that are needed. It might be time with a fine work approach to consider separating those two, to consider the fact that the business of bringing about learning and educational fulfillment in a population calls not necessarily for more resources, but for resources differently deployed. The other thing I will say on the question of educational fulfillment, and where when I consider the conversation on national consciousness that we had 6 years ago and where it is today, is that who we are and who we understand ourselves to be is a key part of education. And I would not feel like myself to stand here and not address the issue of how we physically present and how we allow our children to express themselves in school. The uniform policy, I think what is referred to as a grooming policy, but I prefer to call it uniform policy, that acknowledges that young people in educational institutions have a right and should be allowed to freely express how they physically present to the world, whether that's locks or afros or natural hair or twists, or be able to have locks without having to cover them as if there's something to be ashamed of. That step, as part of an educational landscape, has been significant. I hope we don't stop there in the discussion of how we express ourselves culturally in formal education. The interaction between education and being able to earn a decent wage and find decent work that is capable, and an income that is capable of growth, is the puzzle to solve of this term, of this generation. What we find in communities, and 6 years ago, I talked about having a model that I called a local economic development model. And what did I mean by that? I meant that at the time I was concerned that people in communities would not find their way to national level programs, and that what we needed to do was to find those people. The thing about feeling that you haven't learned anything or that you don't know anything is that it marginalizes you. That people with good common sense often feel that if they cannot profess to have a deep knowledge of something, they should not go anywhere. They should not present themselves to the world. They should not offer themselves further learning. And this is a challenge that we've seen in Barbados, where we find more and more that people are less willing to participate in the formal education that would allow them to become certified and to earn a living and a decent income that is capable of growth. And by that I mean that they're not earning at the same point, at the same level all their lives. So we have an issue of scale and scope, and programs like Construction Gateway program and other programs that seek to do micro-credentialing and give people skills that they can use tomorrow must be scaled up. Because while we are planning for the children of today and tomorrow, we do have a generation alive today that must be met with a new approach to educational fulfillment. My final words on the area of economic insecurity again come back to some of these fine work issues that I spoke about 6 years ago when we were imagining a new development. And we have spoken about things like the decriminalization of vending and created legislation that puts forward the ideology, puts forward the notion that an individual should not be made to feel that they're doing something wrong by earning a living. A co-created development, one where we have rights, but we also have responsibilities, allows us to advance that legislation. Because legislation on its own, sitting on the law books, does not serve unless it works for people. A co-created development, for example, that relates to vending, means that we establish real vending zones, that we appreciate that a part of development is being able to have a predictable and an orderly society. It means that even as we say to people that we are decriminalizing vending, that we must follow through on that by establishing zones in which people can, in ways that they choose and in ways that we create together, are able to freely vend rather than to create the impression or to give the idea that while you have a right to vend, you do not have a responsibility to do so responsibly. I think that we risk, and one of the risks of not having this co-created development, where we talk together about what we want our society to look like, is that we send messages only of the rights, and we do not send messages of the responsibilities. When we fail to follow through on how do we make these ideas work in practical terms for people, for example, by establishing those vending zones, then we send the message that we're only concerned about the rights and that we have no expectation of people's responsibilities to each other. I think the same can be said about what we imagined 6 years ago with respect to investment. At that time, we talked about low interest rates in commercial banks. We talked about the fact that we needed to create investment vehicles for regular Barbadians. And if I apply the lens of how are we doing now, I would say that we must do better. One of my concerns some 6 years later, as we revisit that model that was then proposed of development, is that we are creating incomes, we are creating access to incomes, but we are not helping people to create wealth. And there are many ways that we can do that. One of those is by creating investment vehicles that people with small amounts of resources are able to invest in things that will earn them passive income. Similarly, I do believe that along with education transformation, one of the other major challenges of our generation from a development perspective is land, tenure, ownership, estate planning. Making sure that we collectively agree and understand that we have a responsibility, not just to create vehicles for people to own homes, but to create an understanding that we have to make sure that the wealth we establish is able to be passed on to future generations. One of the ways that we continue to have dispossessed people in this country is by having people who know or feel or believe that they own an asset but cannot prove it. One of the simple ways that we can bring economic security to people, we have to co-create it because it's not something the state can do on its own, is to make sure that people register ownership of assets. Because we have all seen the cases and the stories of people becoming dispossessed from property that they thought they had owned, or not being able to use that property as an asset for further investment. And thereby deepening their poverty and their economic insecurity. And these are some of the parts of the unfinished business of development that I started to discuss some years ago. Now, while I am an advocate for, and those who know me know that I am an advocate, even as a person of faith, of separation of church and state, or separation of faith and state, my conclusion actually comes from a prayer. And it was a prayer that was first presented by a Cardinal Dearden in 1979. It was an excerpt from an homily written for him on the occasion of the Mass for deceased priests in October 1979. And anybody who knows me would be very surprised that I was quoting from such a thing. But it was brought to my attention only a few days ago as we attended a service of thanksgiving for the life of the father of one of our colleagues. And it resonated. And I am pulling some parts from it as I conclude this evening. It says, it helps now and then to step back and take a long view. No statement says all that could be said. No program accomplishes the mission. No set of goals and objectives includes everything. This is what we are about. We plant the seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything. And there's a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way. We who are alive today may never see the end results. We are prophets of a future not our own. Ermie Bourne could not have imagined the seeds she was planting when she offered herself for political service in 1951 and served to 1961. She was a prophet co-creating democracy and development with those of us in her future who are here now because of what she and those of her generation began, demonstrating a transformational leadership that, like many women's leadership, is anchored in collaboration, in co-creation, rather than in transaction. A leadership that guides change through influence and inspiration. that emphasizes performance and implementation, but only while valuing morale and motivation. It is a leadership and a set of values that must be authentic in order to succeed, and that makes space for all to contribute. To listen to the fears and wishes, the voices of Barbadians today and of Caribbean people is to appreciate that it is a new co-created development that is being called for. I believe that we have begun, and I am excited for its future. Thank you.